well, you could assume, but
Okay, we're coming back to the meeting. Sorry for the delay, those of you online. So I'm going to move that we reinstate standing orders. Can I have a seconder, please? Seconded by Councillor Coots. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. That's carried. Okay, so we've got an extra recommendation in front of us, but before I do that, I had James Jefferson wanting to make a comment. Is that about this recommendation? We're back in standing orders now, so the discussion is limited to the what's in the wording of this recommendation.
Yeah, look, good morning, Madam Chair, councillors. Thank you, and it was just to reiterate what the Chief Executive has already said, but I think now that we're back in standing orders, that moment's passed, so thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So we have a recommendation in front of us. Assuming that you'd like to move this recommendation, Councillor McCann?
I would, thank you.
Do I have a seconder? Councillor Elliott, that's right. Councillor Elliott wanted to second. Now I had Councillor Pravanov's hand up, but now that we've moved and seconded this recommendation, right of introduction, Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Councillor Holbrook and Chair. I don't want to repeat everything that's been said because you were commenting about the significant amount of work that we've got to do today. But I think in trying to summarise, we need to be quite clear with the public that we are ensuring that every dollar that we spend is being spent well, and this project has been one that has gone through multiple mutations and a considerable budget blowout towards the end. And for the public, we gave a direction to council staff to continue, but my understanding was further information was going to be presented. That's clearly not held by all councillors, but what this recommendation does is make sure that the information after that we've gone through the consenting process, after that occurs, we then have an opportunity to weigh up what happens next, because there has to be some considerable gaze put on our budgets, and if this budget continues to blow out, then at what point does it not make sense? And I think having this motion ensures that we've got that opportunity. I also understand that that there is some conjecture as to whether this is actually just adding some wording to what would have already occurred, but I think we need to be very, very clear with the public about the process, because it has been somewhat muddy and difficult to follow. And in this case, we will get a report back after the resource consenting process is known. So that means that effectively any more hiccups, any more additional costs, we will then be able to know and make an informed decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCann. I have Councillor Coots next.
So I understand what Councillor McCann is trying to do, and I think many of us councillors over the years have done this on a particular topic. If we know that it's buried within a document, we want to just put a little bit of spotlight. Madam Chair, I know that you quite rightly have done so yourself in terms of noting a specific thing to draw the public's attention or send a signal to either the recipients or stakeholders involved in that particular project or whatever. And I think that's quite appropriate. You know, there's many projects that are within the annual plan CapEx budget that we could put a similar notion to, but they just don't demand the attention, as Councillor McCann has said, around the focus that has been around tuition. So I support the principle of what Councillor McCann is trying to achieve, My concern is what it's then morphed into, and hearing his response to Councillor Randall, how he has serious concerns around whether the project should proceed, is that's another discussion. That's a discussion around the merits of the project and so forth. And I don't think that was what we were given the intention of the motion was when Councillor McCann originally spoke to it. And so I have some concerns around that. I also think the comments from, and I'm sorry to mention about the Councillor Halliday, were inappropriate around staff ambushing elected members. We received an email from Alison Law updating us around the project, and there was some chatter backwards and forwards from elected members around the increased costs. And subsequent to that, we had a briefing on the 5th of May where we were walked through the project, and yes, the updated costings were at the end of the briefing, but we had ample time to talk through that and ask questions of staff, and we gave a steer, as we do on many other topics and briefings, around whether staff proceed or not to do further work, which they have done, as we've heard from the Acting Chief Executive around getting some further costings and so forth. So it's unfortunate that that comment is made. It doesn't build trust and confidence between the elected members and staff, and it's in conflict with what we've tried to expect of staff to build with elected members. So I will be supporting the motion because I again go back to the principles around. I think it's appropriate to put the spotlight on a particular project and just make it very clear to the community that there are some other steps within it. What I struggle with is the request for an additional report. Through the debate around the annual plan, several councillors and in previous meetings have expressed their concern and the pressure and additional workload on staff, and then minutes later add additional pressure and workload through additional reports and briefings. So, I think we have to have a real good look at ourselves when we say those comments and then think about what we request. And again, I've experienced elected members asking where those additional reports are only weeks later. And so my concern, although I appreciate Councillor McCann did acknowledge it in his introduction, is that elected members don't start haranguing staff for that additional report prior to when it should be received. And so I would have liked some clarification around that, so there's no ambiguity. We heard ambiguity today over our understandings from the briefing and what was expected out of that. Absolutely support further discussion around any increased CapEx and putting a spotlight on that Councillor McCann's done. Just think it could have been done in a better way and communicated better. So we haven't ended up in how we have today for an hour or so. So I'll reluctantly be supporting it, but just making those comments around the comments that were made and the additional report and the timing of that report.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I've opposed this project since our first vote on it all the way back in May 2020, and the concerns I've raised throughout it to this day still remain unaddressed. They were out of scope of the independent review, and then external watchdogs didn't get involved, primarily because they didn't have the funding to get involved, and that's something I've written to the Speaker of Parliament and party leaders for them to actually address the resourcing for those officers. But that's a salient issue. I think what this motion is it's a prudent extra sanity check on what's really a contentious project for our community. It's that extra go, no-go decision before we go out to tender, and potentially if, the contractors come back with prices that are well above what council is willing to accept, we end up wasting their time in what's already a very tight construction market for them. We know that this project has hurt the community's perception of the quality of decision-making this table makes. And a big reason for that, which we saw in the independent review, was around the transparency and the communications of what's going on. So this makes it very clear that we're going over and above what we would normally do to ensure that both elected members and the community knows what's going on. We've already seen, as Councillor Coots just alluded to, we've seen contention around what happened in the briefing. The community's not aware of what we get sent in emails in terms of updates about the project. They have no idea what's gone on in those unless they send in Lagoima requests or someone leaks out an email. So this really, I guess, makes sure that we, with this council, and possibly it'll be the next council, is being really upfront and transparent about everything that's going on with this. And we know already that this project has had some significant changes from what we originally voted on in terms of a concept back in 2020. The big one, obviously, was the need to change the car parking arrangements, and that's come with a $750,000 price tags. And we don't actually know what changes might come through in terms of mitigations that might be required to objections lodged during the resource consent process. So there could be significant changes there, there might not be, we just don't know yet. So again, we're making sure the community knows that we're not just gallivanting into this, we're putting an extra step in place to ensure that, you know, we are taking our time to get this right and that the community can see that we're taking it right. And, you know, I'll be clear, I think if you support this, you'll be making the wrong decision, but actually, at least you can say, look, we have been transparent about this. We've learned from the independent review. We've learned from the previous mistakes that were on this project that we are going to be completely upfront. And that's what I think we did good at coming out of that 5th of May briefing where we got the cost update. The very next day, the media release went out to let the community know about that cost increase. We were upfront about that straight away. So that's a good thing. I think, you know, that's a really good change in the way that the project is progressing, at least in terms of its transparency. I can agree. I think back, I always agreed that there needed to be some sort of facility down there. This is bigger than what I'd like, but you know, I think the process is, you know, getting better than what it's been, and I think this just demonstrates that we want to make this as good as possible, as transparent as possible, and ultimately, you know, whether it's this council in our final weeks or presumably, most likely, I'd say the next council making a decision, you know, when we consider that this was originally going to be open, I think our first vote on it said it would be September this year it was going to be open. Then it was pushed back to December of this year. Now it's been pushed back to December of next year. You know, what's another 1 month or 2 months on that timeline and the scope of how far this has been pushed back already? So I'll be supporting this today. And I may well be watching with interest when this comes back in the future.
I think you may have just squeaked under the 5-minute limit there, Councillor Compton. I've actually got Councillor Pravanov via Zoom next, and then to you, Councillor Halliday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I will be supporting this motion here, but I suppose I just wanted to seek, or basically to maybe mention to the mover whether or not it's clear enough whether this report will be coming to a council meeting or whether it will be received as a briefing. So I think the intention of what I'm hearing from Councillor McCann and other elected members is this should be tabled at a council meeting. That's my first point. So, so going back to the discussions we had with the PGF funding potential for this project, and then when it was agreed to, I think my memory is that there were a number of provisos around that, and one of those was to keep elected members up to date and to basically to bring back key milestones to councillors for approval. And to me, this is actually one of those key steps. So even though it's been written in here as an additional report, this to me is actually one of those milestones that should have been reported on anyway. So I just want to remind, I suppose, other councillors of that point. I suppose also too, in agreeing to approval of the annual plan, that that we've all agreed to the extra funding of $3.2 million for the Gateway. I would like it, I suppose, recorded that even though I agreed to the annual plan, I still do not agree with that part. But because it's all wrapped up into it, I had very limited choice. So even though I agreed to the annual plan, I didn't agree to that component. So in summary, I will be supporting this motion, but just suggesting to the mover to rethink about the wording to ensure that it is actually going to come to a council meeting rather than being provided only to councillors in a briefing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bravanoff. I just want to assure you that a report means that it is going to go to a council meeting. I'd also just like you to know what you're voting on, because I think I need to clarify something that you said, which is that this is a normal step that's always taken. This is actually a step over and above what would usually happen, and we've had confirmation from the Chief Executive cause extra work for staff and a 2-month delay. Just so you know what you're voting on today.
Yes, so I agree with that, and I think the briefing that we had in early May was the one that was talked about where this potentially was or was not raised. I'm actually going back to the initial decision making around applying for the PGF funding, and then...
Sorry, Councillor Pavanov, you've actually had your debate. I was just clarifying a couple of things that you said during your presentation. Thank you very much. Councillor Halliday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to just endorse the comments by both Councillors McCann and Compton. My apologies, Councillor Coots, I'm afraid I don't agree with your take on that briefing at all, but I would like to unreservedly apologise to council officers with regards to my very inflammatory comment that I made.
Thank you for that apology, Councillor Halliday. It's much appreciated.
I will vote accordingly when we make our vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you. I'll keep this brief. As the Acting Chief Executive outlined, this report was going to be made to Council. I was certainly expecting it before the annual plan approval today, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Elliott. Do I have anybody else who'd like to contribute to the debate today on this topic? Okay, I'll put the motion. Moved by... Oh, right of reply. Sorry.
Madam Chair, are you not contributing to the debate? Just checking.
No, I don't have an intention to. Thank you, Councillor.
Look, thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to respond. And I do realise this is contentious and not everyone agrees with me putting this motion. But I think Councillor Compton hit the nail on the head, and others have mentioned it too, that we have been trying as a council to make sure that we can build trust back with our community, and that requires as much transparency as possible. And it would be fair to say that most councillors felt they lost control of this project to some degree, and some of that is beyond our control. We had COVID, we had a very difficult and interesting process with the government money and the application, but it was a project that many of us felt uncomfortable with for several reasons and for different reasons. But there was a will around the table to get it done. But again, some of the variables that are around the decision keep changing. And it's important that we keep having a sense check on when those variables change, because we need the public to trust us. They need to know that we're actually taking into consideration what is occurring. And transparency, communication, the Martin Jenkins report clearly alluded to those things. We need to keep on ensuring that we are true to our words as councillors that we wanted to do things differently. So I think the additional report is a really good move. It builds transparency and trust. It ensures the community knows what we're doing, why we're doing it, and I can assure the councillor who raised it that the expectation is that this will come back to a full council meeting in a report. And I urge everyone to support this motion.
Okay, I'll put that motion. All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried. Okay, so we're moving on to setting of rates, 10.2, I believe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. So in terms of...
Apologies, Madam Chair. Councillor Elliott has just called for a division.
I believe that was passed unanimously, Councillor Elliott. Just to confirm, everybody raise their hands.
And then we had all green. And Councillor Randall had said yes, and Councillor Pravanov had said yes. Was there a vote from yourself, Councillor Elliott? And that was a yes as well.
Yes, so I can confirm that was passed unanimously, Councillor Elliott. Moving on now to 10.2, setting of rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, now that the Council has adopted the annual plan for next year, it's in terms of the formalities, it's now time to set the rates. For the following year, I will take the, as we always do, this is subject to legal review. It's an area of focus for audit to make sure the correct processes are followed. What you set in the paper today reflects the funding impact statement rating policy, which is in the annual plan that you have just adopted. So it's had the green tick from legal. That's independently assessed by Simpson Grierson, and we know that our auditors will audit it, and we're confident with that. We do need you to set the rates and take the paper as read, and happy to move to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr de Haast. Councillor Elliott, I believe you had a question about this when we were on the previous paper.
Thank you. Yes, and it's just a question about the page 11 on the printed copy, point 5 and point 6, about the volumetric water rate and the fixed rate. We noted in workshops that there was a $1 million excess to budget in the water account, and we discussed ways to maybe use that to offset the future price of the volumetric and the daily rates for water. And I'll also note that it appears that hasn't happened, and that money, $1 million, was moved out of the water account and used to offset proposed rises in the rates. So if I can just have confirmed that that's what happened, and then I just want to ask how, if you could explain how money was moved out of a fixed water account into a general account. Thank you.
I believe we've been briefed on this, Councillor Elliott. Are you happy to take this question offline with staff? We've got a massive agenda today, and this is quite a big issue. Or would you like it to be answered today?
I've got every right to ask a question of staff before I make a decision on recommendations.
I'm not questioning your right to do so, Councillor Elliott. I'll ask Mr de Haast to answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councillor. So the 7.5% rates increase that's just been approved was reduced by 1.3% from the water account. You will physically see that in the Q1 performance report at the Standard Operations Committee meeting. It wasn't about future. It was about that water account is a closed account, as you correctly said. Over time, we have actually managed to build up a surplus. The council hasn't increased the fixed or the volumetric rate for the last 3 years and hasn't again. So that money. There is no legislation that defines that a water account must be a closed account. It was the will of the council to make it a closed account, to let the metered water, the volumetric and the fixed charges continue for a few years so that we could adjust the price accordingly. The benefit has been given to all ratepayers, and that's how you have landed with a 7.5% rates increase. So it's completely separate to this paper. This paper is where council actually sets the rates. We have discussed how we have kept the rates at 7.5% on the paper of 10.1.
Thank you. Thanks for your explanation.
Mr Mellon?
Oh, sorry, Councillor, I was just going to add that was actually discussed at a workshop, not a briefing, I think, in terms of the annual plan process. So that was a public process in terms of the workshop.
Thanks for that clarification, Mr Mellon. Any more questions on this paper? Councillor Compton's indicated he's happy to move, and Councillor Halliday is seconding. They're the recommendations 3A, 4, etc., starting on page 10 of the agenda. You're happy to move all the recommendations outlined in this paper. Thank you. Any debate? Okay, I'll put that motion. All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried. Thank you very much, Mr de Haast, and pass on our thanks to Joe as well. Thank you. Okay, we're on to 10.3. Seeking approval for public notification of proposed plan changes. And I believe we have Jason Holland to present this report. Welcome, Jason.
Madam Chair, councillors, kia ora koutou. Thanks for making the time to consider this paper. We actually have a PowerPoint presentation which I'm going to walk through. Unusual. You don't get many of those. So we'll just wait for that to get brought up. But just before it is, this is a report to you which is seeking your approval for public notification of 4 plan changes. It is with us now. And so these are 4 plan changes that are ones that we've talked to you about way back in October of last year originally, at which time we sought your approval to do more work on them and consult on them as drafts. And they were part of a suite, a wider sweep. So I'll get on to talking a little bit more about that shortly, but maybe even going back a little bit further and just reflecting actually on the amount of work that you've done in district planning this triennium, because it has been a big one for district planning. In this triennium, of course, we've resolved appeals, completed variations, and made the proposed district plan operative, which was quite the achievement. And that was done on the 30th of June 2021, which feels a long time ago now. We also have a long-term plan that has some detail in it about what comes next for the district plan. And in the long-term plan, it talks about a rolling review. So one option for a council is always to do a full review, which was what was done in 2012. But in the long-term plan, we've actually embarked upon a program of plan changes out for a number of years. And the first batch of plan changes we talk about as an omnibus package. And what that means is it's really a range of different issues. I hesitate to say it, but relatively small, each of them in scope, and relative to, say, the intensification plan change, in terms of the amount of significance and scale. Each of these omnibus plan changes, 13 in the first package, relatively small in scope, scale and significance. We've actually already come to you and you've approved public notification of 3 of those. Plan changes 1A, 1B and 1C they were called. So you'll get used to that language of a number and a letter. That's the omnibus package way. So we've already publicly notified 3 of the 13 in the package. And that was your decision of the 10th of February earlier this year. We've also been working on other ones, and the 4 that I'll be talking about today in particular. And in the council report, you'll see quite a lot of discussion about the consultation that has been done. Council has gone not only so far as to meet the Resource Management Act requirements, but quite a lot further, and has exercised its discretion to consult wider than the minimum requirements of the Resource Management Act for these plan changes. We've also completed Section 32 reports for each of them, as is required by Schedule 1 of the Resource Management Act. You need to have those reports and have particular regard to those reports at this point in the plan making process. So, as I mentioned, we are here to seek your approval to publicly notify the plan changes I'm going to walk you through, and that will set in train another opportunity for consultation on these plan changes. So it is certainly fair to say that the public and potentially affected people really have had a good chance already to have their say, but they'll have another chance to have their say if you make a decision to publicly notify these plan changes. So it's not the end of the road today. That's an important point. And I'll talk a bit more about next steps at the end of this presentation. So these are the 4 plan changes that are in front of you, 4 of the 13 in the original package. And I'm going to go through each of these and talk a little bit more about them now. So plan change 1D affects 3 streets, and those are listed up there: Arawhata Road, Tūtenakai Street and Ventnor Drive. And its purpose is really to make sure that they are classified correctly in the transport network hierarchy. And what that basically means is that they're recognised for their current and projected transport sort of use, and that developments on those roads are appropriately managed to ensure safety, with the busier roads having requirements such as requiring on-site manoeuvring, whereas the quieter roads, Ventnor Drive is an example of that, where those sorts of requirements aren't necessary. That's pretty much, in a lot more words, what I just said. And you'll get the sense as we go through this presentation that all of these plan changes, if I was to characterise them, are common sense things to do. A lot of them are fixing things up so that the district plan is easier to implement and is just more appropriate for the issues that it's tackling. So it's a common theme of today. So these are the roads as they are. In case you weren't familiar, Arawhata is a pretty main drag. You'll be familiar with that one. Tūtenakai is off Arawhata, and Ventnor is more of a quieter little road. So what we're looking to do there is to just correct things and just make sure that Tūtenakai and Arawhata are moved up the transport hierarchy, and therefore developments next to those roads are sort of calibrated more in terms of requiring on-site manoeuvring so that people aren't having to reverse onto those busier roads, and relaxing that slightly for Ventnor Drive because it's a quieter street. So really just common sense changes.
At the end.
I will add too that I've got a team behind me virtually who I will use to assist me with answering questions. And this particular plan change, Alan Davidson is the planner for this, so I'll certainly be looking to use Alan's expertise on this one. So with plan change 1D, we did write to landowners on the streets, and we got some feedback. We didn't receive any feedback saying we don't think the reclassification is a good idea. What we got more of was feedback around concerns generally about safety on those roads, because people are observing that people were driving a bit fast. Those aren't a matter that the district plan can deal with, so we've worked with our access and transport team to make sure that those who did bother to get back to us, and it was good of them to do so, actually got a response to their feedback. So the next plan change, and this will be a whistle-stop tour, plan change 1F is about Indigenous vegetation, and we have the help of a consultant planner, Matt Muspratt, who I'll be using to answer questions on this one if there are any. So again, very much another plan change which is looking to do some common sense things. This plan change actually does two particular things, and we couch them under the heading of Indigenous vegetation. One of them is to amend a controlled activity rule, and in case that you aren't aware, a controlled activity is an activity or a consent that has to be granted but can be granted subject to conditions. There is a controlled activity rule that has had unintended consequences, unfortunately. A rarely used rule. The evidence that we have is that there's only been a couple of resource consent applications in the 10 years of this rule having legal effect under this rule, but unfortunately with one of them it led to more vegetation removal than was intended by the rule. The rule is really intended to allow people to modify or perhaps remove Indigenous trees where they're essentially a threat to property or people. There are a few other reasons, but broadly speaking, it's certainly not something that was intended to allow broad-scale vegetation removal, and unfortunately there has been an example where that did occur under that rule. So we're moving pretty swiftly, or at least in planning timeframes, pretty swiftly to address that issue, and we've proposed some amendments to that rule to constrain just how much vegetation removal and the circumstances in which that can be removed a bit more. The other amendment in this plan change is a useful one. It's recognising that at the moment our key Indigenous tree list only captures Kanuka as one species. Now there's the Kanuka that we all know that grows like billio a bit more, and then there's the little coastal Kanuka which struggles against the elements and takes a bit more time to mature, and essentially the dimensions for Kanuka that we have in our key Indigenous tree species list are too large to provide any useful protection to coastal Kanuka. So what we've proposed to do, on the advice of an ecologist, is to include coastal Kanuka as its own separate species, have its own dimensions, and therefore make sure that it is suitably protected as well. And again, that's pretty much what I've just said. Only to add, of course, that as with all plan making, we are obliged to make sure we give effect to national direction, regional direction, and in this case there is a matter of national importance which has been a very key factor in making sure that we needed to address this issue. So we have consulted on this plan change, as we have with all four, and in this case we actually got a range of feedback, all supportive, but also with some suggesting some useful further amendments, and those have done things like make sure that we've been very clear in the wording of the rule, and that we are even going even further to make sure that we don't leave open any opportunities for inadvertent consequences, because of course that's really what the purpose of this plan change was driven to do. So useful feedback from those parties listed. Second to last plan change, electoral signage, no doubt an issue which will be close to your heart reasonably soon, or many of you. The district plan at the moment essentially has one number in it that isn't the number that is in the national regulations for this issue. The number is to do with the maximum permitted size of a sign. The national regulations talk about it being a maximum of 3 square metres. The district plan talks about it being a maximum of 2 square metres. This is simply to align the two so that the numbers are the same. And there you go in e-plan format. Perhaps not surprisingly, even though we went out broadly with this, we didn't actually get any feedback on it. And again, this is the theme, common sense fixes. And finally, the fourth of the plan changes is looking to rezone a number of council-owned sites. Many of those sites, in fact the large majority, are sites that have been vested in council through subdivision processes, and their purpose in being vested in council was to make sure that there was enough reserves around the place for people's needs. So what we're really looking to do for the majority of these sites is to catch up the district plan zoning with the purpose of this land. In a way, it's a little irritating that we even have to do a plan change to do things. Some of these things would have been nice just to have some automatic button that we could press, but this is the Resource Management Act, ladies and gentlemen, and we are simply required to follow it. So what we've done is we've applied appropriate zonings and precincts to that land. The district plan is quite clear which to pick in different circumstances. So essentially natural open space zone is where there are a lot of high natural state values or have the potential to be. Open space zones have 2 precincts as opposed to natural open space zone. So open space zone can be either a recreation precinct, which is like a destination park or a sports ground, sort of larger areas. Open space zone local parks precinct is more your local park, which has a couple of swings, useful for the kids in the local neighbourhood, or it might be a little access way through to somewhere else between streets, or to a school, or even to a different reserve. The district plan kind of codifies what all of those things should be, and we're really just applying the rules that are already in the district plan about what to apply. And as it notes at the bottom there, all this plan change is about is applying the right zones. It's not actually about doing anything to the objectives, the policies or the rules. It's just applying the right zoning classifications. The 2 exceptions to the rule, if you like, are the public park area of McLean Park, and there is a toilet block car park area next to Jim Cook Memorial Park. And in those cases, the existing zonings are just simply not appropriate. If I talk about McLean Park, which you'll all be familiar with, it's full of playgrounds, it's got car parking areas, it's got footpaths. Natural open space zone is not a good fit with that. I suspect it was pretty much back in the day probably just lumped in with the surrounding coastal dunes areas and not kind of separately identified. All we're doing here is making sure that area, which is clearly not a natural state area, is appropriately zoned to being an open space zone. And because they're both destination park areas, the recreation precinct is a no-brainer choice. So just a really quick idea of where some of these reserves are, because a lot of them are small and you probably wouldn't be familiar with them. A few to the north, and kind of more to around the Paraparaumu and a little bit further south of that. So all of that information is in the Section 32 report. And those are those 2 I mentioned, which were sort of the exceptions to the rule, if you like, but are all about, again, common sense, addressing kind of historical errors, really, and just making sure that there's appropriate zoning that reflects their current use. So we consulted broadly on this one again, but we also did write to neighbouring landowners who would have and it's always dangerous to characterise effects as being small, but I've gone this far, so I'll keep going. I would say it's a relatively small effect on them in terms of the fencing provisions that apply. So when you're a neighbour of one of these zones, there's a slightly different new fence height you can build as a permitted activity versus being a neighbour of a general residential zone property. When you're a neighbour of a general residential zone property, you can build up to a 2 metre high new fence as a permitted activity. When you're a neighbour of one of these open space zone properties, you can build a new fence up to 1.8 metres. None of that change means that if you've already got a 2 metre high fence, you don't have to do anything different, you're fine. Lawfully established fence above 1.8 is fine. And under Section 10 of the Resource Management Act, you have existing use rights, which means you can replace that fence to the same height, even if it's more than 1.8. So there's that little difference in terms of if someone didn't have a fence at all, they'd need to get a resource consent to do a 2 metre high fence, but they could still do a 1.8 as a permitted activity, and that's why I characterise this as, in terms of effects, I would say relatively small. So we clarified those sorts of things with neighbours, and we received some questions of clarification, but we didn't really get what we characterise as being opposing feedback to the rezoning. So it was a useful exercise, I guess, to raise awareness and clarify some things. So if you are of a mind to make the decision to approve these 4 plan changes for public notification, one of those will have immediate legal effect, and that is the one that I talked about, the Indigenous vegetation one. It's the one which is looking to, for that controlled activity rule, just make sure that we don't have any more inadvertent consequences of broad-scale Indigenous vegetation removal under that rule. So that would have immediate legal effect, as would rules associated with the coastal Kānuka table, including that in that table. The other plan changes won't have immediate legal effect. So if you are of a mind as councillors to make this decision today, we would proceed to publicly notify the plan changes. You've been here before with 1A, 1B and 1C, by the way. But a reminder of the process. So a 20 working day submission period is the default position under the Resource Management Act. Following notification, we would then summarise the decisions that anybody requested if we get submissions, and that would trigger a further submission or a cross-submission process where people get to say what they think of what other people had to say. If there are submissions and they wish to be heard, there'd be a hearing where people would get the opportunity to speak to an independent hearing panel, and that panel would then develop its report and recommendations, we would bring that back to a future council, the next council, and that council would then have a choice decision to make about whether it adopts the report and recommendations of that hearings panel as its own decision. And at the point that it would notify that decision, then there would be a right of environment court appeal on that, which is the usual way with plan changes. So that's our PowerPoint presentation. And yeah, I think, Madam Chair, I'll leave it with you now.
Thank you very much for that PowerPoint presentation, Jason. So I think did I have Councillor Pravanov's hand up online, or was that just still up from before? It was up before. Councillor Compton, did you have a question?
I did. I have 4 questions through the chair. The first one is the reclassification of roads and that the requirement to have on-site manoeuvring. is that consistent with the National Policy Statement on Urban Development's requirements to no longer have car parking provisions? Because in the section 32, it refers to the NPSUD, but it doesn't address, I guess, the interplay between you're not meant to have car parking requirements. Is the on-site manoeuvring effectively treated separately from that, even though in practicality it's going to be used for car parking, I imagine?
That's a very good question, Councillor. We thought long and hard about that issue, and yeah, we're certainly aware that, just maybe to give a bit of broader context, so it's absolutely correct that the district plan cannot and no longer does set minimum car parking requirements. And we removed those as a council in February this year because that's what the National Policy Statement for Urban Development requires of councils to do. We have reintroduced at the same time accessible car parking requirements, and that's proposed plan change 1A. So there will be some developments that, because that had immediate legal effect, will require accessible car parking. That multi-unit residential above, I think, 4 units is one of those. But it is true that now it is a choice that people have as to whether or not they wish to provide on-site parking as opposed to a minimum requirement in the plan. So we did consider, really more in the context of the intensification plan change, whether or not it would be possible through that plan change to do some amendments to the relevant rule, such that on-site manoeuvring was only required where somebody either had to through the accessible car parking or proposed to, because they just chose to, provide on-site parking. It occurred to us that could be a possibility through the intensification plan change as a consequential change. What we found when we talked about it internally, and we did have some really deep conversations internally with our transport team, is it's not as straightforward as we might have hoped. It may well be that somebody proposes not to provide on-site parking, but the plan doesn't define what on-site parking is, and it seems that the experience has been that somebody might not put a garage on, they might not propose to provide on-site parking, but there just so happens to be just enough space to nose a car in, and it might hang half over the footpath or whatever, but it still ends up that somebody has put a car on the property. And unless we went further, and I'm not saying this would be a bad idea at all, but it would take more time, and did something like define on-site car parking very clearly so that everybody was on the same page about what it was and it wasn't, we would run the risk of people ending up reversing onto these very busy roads. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I think we accept that there is an issue there, but it's a little more complicated than we thought, and it's going to require a bit more time to work through a full solution. And it may well be that it's a subsequent plan change that looks at that. We have a transport plan change a little bit further out in the program as one way. There could be a future omnibus.
No, perfect. That was really helpful. The next question is, in terms of the modification of Indigenous vegetation provisions, sort of broadly, the stuff that's already in the plan effectively would protect stuff that, the vegetation that gives, say, the Waikanai Garden Precinct its garden aspect, wouldn't it? So that sort of local character is protected by the mere existence of that, and that those Indigenous vegetation provisions won't change, say, when the NPSUD comes in. They still remain in effect, don't they?
Yeah, this plan change is a very niche plan change. It's only changing, putting the coastal Kanuka to one side, it's only changing one rule, and it's one controlled activity rule, and it's only ever been intended to be used in very narrow circumstances. And it's actually it's narrowing the circumstances where that rule can be used. So in a sense, I guess what we're arguing here is we are actually increasing protection for Indigenous vegetation, because we're, as a council, we would be reducing the circumstances where that rule could be applied to address the issue that popped up with that one consent. Yes, that's what you're saying is broadly correct, that the existing provisions, well, it is correct that the existing provisions in terms of protecting ecological sites recognised in the plan, protecting notable trees which are listed in the plan, those things will live on, those protections will still apply. It is fair to say that not every Indigenous tree that people might drive past and go, oh, that's a nice tree, will necessarily be protected by those provisions, because, for example, a notable tree register does not capture every tree that everybody drives past and says it's a nice tree. And similarly, you might see three nice trees together and go, oh, that's a nice little block of bush. The ecological sites in the district plan might not necessarily protect those particular three trees that you think are a nice piece of bush. Decisions have been made over the years to say things have to meet quite a high criteria to be put in the plan. And so it's those things that meet those criteria that will be protected.
Perfect. Third question is, does the rezoning of McLean Park, does that have any impact in terms of the way it functions as a reserve and the reserve strategy and what sort of activities are permitted in there? Because I know that was quite a contentious point when we were discussing Te Uri here. I think we had the consultants report on it back in February last year. Does that have any flow-on effects to that reserve management strategy for McLean Park?
So I might hand over to Alan, and Jeanette's going to shoot me because I didn't actually introduce Jeanette, just a little wee side issue. But important. Jeanette was actually our lead planner on the electoral signage provisions, by the way, so I just need to make sure. Good, great. Well, an early introduction to Jeanette. But before we get to Jeanette and that question, Alan, you may have something to add there. I think the councillor's question was to do with does this plan change perhaps align?
I guess, does it change the way that the reserve management plan for McLean Park works, given the rezoning of it?
Morning, everybody. It won't change the way that it's managed as such. And excuse me, I'm just looking at the rules up on the district plan, so I'm looking to the side. So there will still be the same permitted activities that apply for recreation and local parks precincts. So for Jim McLean Park, it will become a recreation precinct, which it actually sort of is in reality at the moment anyway. So it's just actually clarifying that zone between the natural open space zone, which is like the coastal margin and the dunes, etc., and then the area that is used more for recreation use. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
And now the final question about electoral signage. Now, I'm very glad this is there, because I remember in 2019 I emailed through to our electoral officer being like, are you aware this doesn't line up with the national legislation? And they're very good and said we won't enforce the district plan thing. So that it's nice to see that we've been aligning there. But what's come to mind is this week there's an issue identified in Wellington City where a certain candidate there has been running a billboard ahead of what their electoral officer said was a 6-week window ahead of the elections. But having poured through their district plan and their bylaws, they have no restriction on when you could run a big digital sign advertising your campaign. I guess we're only addressing one issue of electoral signage here, but does our district plan or our bylaws prohibit someone from doing that up here, or could someone go literally tomorrow and hire the billboard down Kapiti Road and do that? I think we've got protections stopping people from doing that, but is it something we need to address through this?
I will pass that to Jeanette. Jeanette, have you got anything for the councillor there?
Tim, did you want to?
Oh, that might not be.
Tim's going like this. I don't know what he means.
I was going to say I believe it is actually something that requires a resource consent to do an equivalent thing to what Councillor Eagle was doing. But Tim, have you got something you'd like to add there?
Sorry, happily I was. Hang on, Tim.
Okay.
Wait, just wait. They'll sort it out. Just wait for the
Sorry, happily or not, I was involved in giving some advice to Wellington City Council on the Mr. Eagle issue. You're quite right. There is a gap in the Wellington City Council district plan. There is a provision in the Kapiti Coast district plan that does impose the time limit. I've got that email pulling out that particular provision, but I can't, it's not readily at hand. One thing just to note, the electoral regulations that are referred to in this plan change don't cover local body elections, so they're focused on central government elections.
Oh.
Staff, I'm going to go to Councillor McCann next because he had his light on at the start and I didn't spot it, so I think he's next in the queue.
Well, thank you. Councillor Compton's covered some of my questions, but I did have one around the electoral signage. If I remember rightly, and you have to help me with this, Council lowered the maximum height, and if I remember correctly, Guru was towering above us at the time. With the increase in size, are we now creating signs that are literally almost on the ground, ready to be kicked and destroyed? Have we thought through that? Am I behind the times?
Can I answer that one?
So, Jeanette, I think you're back. Great. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
sorry,
Over to you.
technical issues before. The height requirement is 1.8 metres, so that has remained unchanged. I believe that if that's been something that's changed in the past, that has remained the same now. Does that answer your question?
Can I clarify? That's the height that it was changed to from...
No, the height has not changed. That's from ground level, 1.8 metres from ground level.
So 1.8 metres from ground level, and the maximum size of the sign is?
3 metres.
3 metres.
Squared. And that's where we've made the change in line with the legislation.
So, I'm sorry, I'm having a brain hemorrhage. So 3 metres is larger than 1.8. Are you saying 3 metres squared?
3 metres squared is the size of the sign, the surface area of the sign can be. 1.8 metres above ground level is the limit.
Which is one. So what I was saying originally is, so that is what it can be 1.8 high, but the actual sign would be 1.5 max. So we're effectively having signs on the ground. Is that?
The only thing about the height, is that it does not exceed 1.8 metres in height above original ground level.
And 3 metres squared means how high would it be? Who can do the maths in the head?
Depends on the size dimension.
If it's the maximum.
There's no ground clearance element to it.
No.
Actually, I think my miming was incorrect. I think it should have been like that.
You get big horizontal signs. Landscape signs, not portrait.
But whether it's 500 off the ground or a metre.
Those of you online, Jason has just mimed the size of the sign, which goes kind of from around his height and then down to about thigh level.
There's just also the clarification of what an electoral sign is. That is, whereabouts is that held?
It's a good question.
Because there was, some online, it was by the Deputy Mayor suggesting some of my work was electoral work because it had my name and address on it as an authorisation.
Is this relevant to the paper at hand, Councillor McCann? I'm going to rule that it's irrelevant. Continue questioning on another topic, please.
Thank you for ruling it's irrelevant. Could I have that question outside this meeting then? Because I'm quite confused as to what electoral signage is and isn't.
That wasn't an electoral sign. So, Jocelyn Pravanov is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Jason, for bringing this report to the table today. So, first of all, I have a question around the street reclassification. I'm just interested to know, particularly in Arafata Road. Arafata Road is a major thoroughfare, and obviously you got some feedback from the residents there, but it's also used by a lot of other people, and I suppose I'm really interested to know what impact it's going to have on those people. So there's a footpath there which people use for biking and cycling. I'm not sure whether people park on the side of the road there, possibly not. But yeah, so what impacts is this change going to have on outside users of that road, please?
Sure, Councillor. So probably the first thing to clarify is that if you're not proposing a new development that would be involving the kinds of activities that would need a resource consent on occasion, then if you're just doing what you're doing, you don't need to do anything different. So people who have houses along there that aren't proposing to do anything different won't have to change anything. So in that sense, for them and therefore for those around them, there won't be a change. But if somebody wants to do some development of their land, for example, if they wanted to take advantage of the more enabling district plan that's going to be coming through reasonably soon to council for its consideration in terms of the intensification plan change, if they wanted to take advantage of the more enabling provisions that will come through and more intense developments, multiple units on a single site, that kind of thing, or going higher, then for those developments, what's being proposed here will ensure greater safety. It's all about that, really. So those pedestrians, cyclists won't be confronted with volumes of vehicles reversing onto the road, not really being able to see too well behind them. It will be a safer environment for everybody. That's really what the plan change is trying to deliver, and you would see that incrementally as developments happen over time. So it's not, as with many plan change things, they're the long game. They're trying to set the conditions for good development over time, and in this case the plan change is looking to provide for safe development over time.
Thank you. So if there is developments in a particular area, obviously there's going to be more cars going in and out, crossing over the footpaths there. So how will that actually have to be addressed by the developer, or how would that be resolved? Because obviously that is going to have an impact on people using the footpath along there.
Yeah, there are some inbuilt, more detailed directions that are through the subdivision and development minimum requirements, which is something that applies to all developments. It's like the engineering standards in the plan. They're really important for making sure that things like access ways are well designed. So that's probably the primary answer. It's through that document and how that's embedded into the plan that those very important engineering details are achieved on a development by development basis.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to push this too much, but I suppose, you mentioned the word minimum requirements, and I'm just wondering whether those minimum requirements would be less than what is actually already in place at this point in time, which have been put in by KCDC.
Well, I can, just again looking ahead to the intensification plan change and a recent consultation that has been completed by Council on the next edition of the engineering standards, which will be called the Land Development Minimum Requirements. So kind of a new improved set of engineering standards will be considered by Council for incorporation into the district plan as part of Plan Change 2. So that's something that will be coming to Council in a few weeks' time as part of Council's intensification plan change.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So now I'm going to move on to the Indigenous vegetation section. Paragraph 26 on page 18 of the hard copy here. It says here, while ensuring the intent of the rule is largely retained, that is to ensure property owners to manage significant health and safety risks to people and buildings posed by dangerous trees. So I just want to seek some clarification around there. So is the impetus for having this section in here to do with health and safety of people, or is it to do potentially with protecting trees from the likes of developers, or from, I don't know how it works with people who do have trees that are falling over or potentially need to be trimmed because they are a health and safety issue?
So the intent of the rule was to, I guess, protect people and property from disease, dying Indigenous trees that might be a real hazard because they are not stable anymore and are very heavy things that you don't want falling on your head or your house.
So in saying that, you're saying that the rules have got slightly tighter, so that means it's going to be more difficult for someone who has a what's the word you used that changed the name of the word, either a protected tree or a protected vegetation. It's actually going to be more difficult for them to have it removed?
No, Councillor. That for that purpose, the intent of this plan change is to make sure that people can still use this rule for that purpose. But what we've found, and this is what has been the genesis of this plan change, is that the rule was being used for an entirely different purpose, and there's quite a bit of discussion about that in the attachments 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Councillor Pavanov, could I just have an indication of how many more questions you intend to ask? Just that's 5 or 6.
2 more.
Great, thank you.
So, so maybe it needs to be slightly, the background to this might need a little bit more explanation. So, you mentioned that this has been precipitated by some activities where things have happened that possibly shouldn't have done. I'm aware of an instance where that has happened quite recently, and I suppose it's fine and dandy having these rule changes, but when I'm hearing that the key biodiversity officers in a...
Is there a question in what you're saying,
Yes,
Councillor
yes, there is. When I hear that those people are not actually being involved in such a resource consent, how is this going to work well? That is my question. And I'm referring to knee-cow palms here.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor, I'm not familiar with the example you're talking about. This plan change does respond, though, to a worked example in real life of where the rule was used. And as it turned out, we've learnt from that the rule enables things to happen which were not intended. And so the purpose of this plan change is to make sure that this rule operates as intended, which is to allow people to get consent to remove an Indigenous tree or modify it as necessary if it's a threat to people or to property. And it also, just for general councillors' information, there are also permitted activity rules that do enable some trimming to occur of key Indigenous trees. So resource consent isn't always required for minor sort of trimming type activities.
Okay. So I was just wondering whether Mr. Jefferson would like to make some comments.
No, I think that's a sufficient answer to the question. Thanks. If you want further comment from Mr. Jefferson, maybe you could take that offline. Did you have one more question?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, I do. Sorry, I do. In relation to the land that has been reclassified as public space type land, is that going to be gazetted as well?
Sorry, Councillor, I'm not really quite sure what you mean by gazetted.
Yeah, so I think when, and I know this has come up at the Waikanae Community Board, that when a piece of land is that the land use is reassigned, it needs to be gazetted with the Gazette Office, New Zealand Gazetting, and it's mine. Yeah, I'm just checking to make sure that that step is also occurring. I think there might be a bit of a backlog with some of the other parks and reserves in the district as well.
Yeah, I mean, most of these, you'll see, I think it's Annex 1 of the attachment, which is the Section 32 for that plan change.
Yep.
5, I think.
What page is that on? Just so I don't...
Now, that's stretching me, Councillor. But Annex 1 of attachment 5, hopefully that's enough direction for you. You'll see that of the areas that are listed, almost all of them are already local purpose reserve of one type or another. So I suspect the answer to your question is what's probably already been done for the great majority of them. And I imagine it would be in the parks area or possibly the property team which would look at, for those remainder that are fee simple, dealing with any of those sorts of things. It's certainly beyond the district plan to do so.
Yeah, so it's just actually finishing off the job completely. It's outside council. It needs to go to the National Gazetting Office.
So we have staff in the room who've been listening to that question, Councillor Pravanoff. I think it's slightly outside the scope of this report. So if you need any further information, or if there's any concerns around that, I'm sure they'll be in touch. I'm going to move on now to Councillor Halliday.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. And I think what Councillor Pravanoff was alluding to was in response to some people coming to a community board meeting last year and stitching it up about gazetting as such. But that's nothing to do with my question. I only have the one. It's in relation to 43.2.2 on page 21, but more relevant to page 183. Just concerns the Ara Street Reserve down at Raumaki Beach. I know it's 940 square metres of land that's currently general residential, and I was wanting to know, well, personally I'd like to have the option removed if possible, but wanted to know what the process would potentially be if that land could potentially be looked at to be used for maybe small or tiny home housing, or be considered for that as well. It's an unusual piece of land, it's an unusual spot, and if you were to put some tiny housing on that, it would be an unusual circumstance. But we haven't made any provision towards looking towards tiny housing or anything like that at all, and I was just wondering whether that one piece of land could particularly be put aside for that to be maybe considered on, and whether this process, if it is to be classified as an open park, would make that a difficult process further on down the track.
So I guess that I might hand over to Ellen to see if she's got any comment about that. But before I do, I'd maybe just reflect a little bit on the process that's led us to make this recommendation. So first of all, I believe this is one of those pieces of land that was vested in council through a subdivision process for a reserve purpose, which is a factor. We've then worked internally with our parks team and our property team, I think, to make sure that these are recommendations that are whole of council type recommendations, so we're not going off on a limb ourselves and the district plan team. The other factor, I guess, to bring to councillors' minds when you're thinking about that is that you do have a intensification plan change, which a draft has been consulted on recently, and you'll be considering that in a few weeks' time for exactly the same decision as you're being asked for today. And in that plan change are a range of things that will much more enable of the sorts of greater density type living options that a tiny home initiative is across the general residential zones of the district. It also, the draft that was consulted on did include quite a number of sites that would be actually rezoned to general residential from a less developable zone to general residential. So you're going to have a plan change put in front of you very soon, which is going to quite significantly change the ability to do things akin to tiny homes right across the district. So I guess I just wanted to bring that to councillors' mind before you consider the point that you're raising.
Thank you for that answer. Sorry, just give me a second here to have a little bit of a think about that. With regards to looking at what I just talked to as an option, would it be something that would be done at this process, or is that something that would be done after the consultation process?
I think councillors have the option of considering it now. The alternative is that people would be entitled to make a submission on these proposed rezonings and suggest a more appropriate zoning. That's something that a submitter could raise post when it gets publicly notified. So,
I think that would be the best option, to let it go to the submission process and then for submissions to come in. Certainly don't have enough information at the table today to make any changes. Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Coots.
Councillor Coots has a comment.
Look, Madam Chair, it's up to you because I shouldn't be commenting. My apologies.
Okay. Okay, so if that's the end of your questions,
no, Madam Chair. Like, the reason I bring this up is I had alluded to this through the process with regards to this, and we were looking at this being potentially addressed at this stage of the process. That's why I'm bringing it up. If it's more appropriate at the next stage of the process, absolutely fine with that, with some consideration taken in case of that. That's what I was referring to. If there is, I would perhaps touch base with Councillor McCann, who looks after the housing portfolio, see if there's potentially an interest there, or whether it's been looked at, or it's something that could be looked at and perhaps brought in with the consultation process as such.
So this is questions. So that wasn't a question. Any other questions? Councillor Elliott.
Madam Chair, there being no more questions, I'm happy to move recommendations A and B.
Do I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Handford. We'll open for debate.
Okay. I'd like to thank staff for your enormous amount of work on these plan changes. It's a move forward, but it's very much our basic workload. And yes, very happy to support this. Thank you for explaining and answering all the questions today too.
Councillor Coots.
Probably just more appropriately responding in debate. my apologies, Councillor Halliday. I think around the table we've discussed when bits of land have come up around we could do this or we could do that, and the response generally has been to look at it rather than piecemeal on occasion by occasion as through the housing strategy and the appropriate channels. There is naturally the tendency to look at individual pieces as they come up, and it's just not a very strategic approach, or I guess the most planned way to make decisions. And that's why we have strategies and so forth. So I think the idea has merit in terms of things like the tiny homes and so forth, but in the process of these types of meetings, it's probably not the best way that we make those decisions.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think it's relevant that as we've moved to a new phase where instead of just selling off land, we want to make sure that it fits in the housing strategy. It's probably a safety check that Martin is asking the relevant questions, and perhaps in the report one simple line could be that these properties have been run through that process and they don't fit. So I think it's a very relevant question, and given that we have quite a change in the personnel of the housing team, maybe that's something that could just happen offline, is that they do run through a sense check to see whether there's any possibility, and then that can be brought back in the paper after the consultation process. So thank you for raising it, Martin. I think it's relevant.
Councillor Halliday.
Thank you for the advice, Councillor McCann. That's all I was really asking for. So appreciate that. And Mr. Holland, thank you very much for what is always a very concise and informative presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks very much to you and your team behind you and for your responses to some curly questions today, and for a great report. So we look forward to this being finalised, and presumably there's more rounds of these coming up.
Indeed.
We wait with bated breath. Right of reply, Councillor Elliott?
Thank you all very much, and I'll just comment on Councillor Halliday's comments, which I think his questions were absolutely timely, given that in a briefing just 2 days ago we were told that the district plan and the new housing rules that we are bringing in have enabled tiny homes to actually happen here on Kapiti in their communities. So very timely, and I'd like you all to support this, the recommendations in front of you.
Thank you. So I'll now put the recommendations the resolutions A and B. All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? They're carried. Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you, team online. We now move to item 10.4, amendments to the council delegation to staff. Oh, we're just checking if food is there. We might break for lunch. Right? Is the food there?
Lunch is there, and I think it's hot.
Yeah, there could be a bit of a discussion around the next item. I think, yeah, we'll break for lunch now if that's okay. I know you've been waiting. Sorry. Okay, we'll break until 1:45. We'll take a 20-minute break so we can keep pressing on.